Fowler, Provision 7. The nurse, in all roles and settings, advances the profession through research and scholarly inquiry, professional standards development, and the generation of both nursing and health policy. Now, on the surface of it, some of you students might be thinking, "Wow, that's really dry stuff this week." Well, you know, I loved this chapter. And I know you're tired. I know we're getting toward the end of the term, and it's a 6-hour course, and it's been a challenging 6 hours. But you're almost there, so hang in there. Word of explanation and confession. I like the book of Leviticus. Now, any of you that are familiar with the Old Testament book of Leviticus, you might say, wow, that is really dry reading. And in some ways it is, but one of the things that, I don't know, maybe it's a particular strength of mine. I think it is, but some might not think so. But maybe it's just the bent of my personality. I like finding encouraging, provocative, wonderful ideas in the most unexpected places. And Provision 7, you know, for you, it might be one of those places, but for me, I loved this chapter. And here are some things I loved about it. And I will say that this one little prepositional phrase in Provision 7 really kind of brought it all together for me. The nurse in all roles and settings. And of course, what Fowler talks about a lot in this chapter has to do with research and doing research correctly, relying on proper evidence, the importance of humanities, and specifically, it seems that she talks more about history and ethics, which is a discipline within philosophy, and theology too, actually. But she spends a lot of time with those ideas, but kind of subtext through all of that is that the nurse participates in these activities in all roles and settings. There's not just one role. And in other words, research isn't only done at the university. Research isn't only done in a research lab. Research can be done in a lot of different contexts. And so one of the other things that one of the other points that she makes is that just because someone is not a researcher per se, that is, that you are directing a research inquiry or you've got a grant that you're responsible for and you're doing research in response to, in fulfillment of that grant, that doesn't exempt us from participating in and being a part of research team and to have ideas. This is one of the great things about what you're doing right now. You're opening up new avenues, new vistas perhaps, new ways to think about your nursing practice. And I love that. I just love those kinds of activities. I love them in my own life. I love them in my own career. How can I think about my discipline differently than I've thought about it in the past? And what can I do to further the discipline as a whole, maybe a specific part of the discipline? So while I'm a person attached to the School of Theology, and I really like talking about all kinds of theological ideas, specifically I'm in the scripture area, so I'm focused a little bit more on the Bible. And within that, I'm focused more on the Hebrew Bible. I'm focused, that is, the First Testament or the Old Testament. And within that, I drill down even a little bit farther to two areas. One has to do with the way the Spirit of God is portrayed in the Old Testament, and the other one has to do with the so-called historical books or the former prophets, and that would be like Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. So there's the wider discipline, and then there's the drill down. Well, you're in that same situation, right? There might be the wider discipline, and your creative juices are going there, but there's probably a specific that you are interested in as well. Anyway, in all roles and settings. So as I read Fowler this time, it is through that lens, right? We all have a certain lens with which we read text. That's my lens. I'm looking for those kinds of things because those ideas are of particular interest to me in this book or in this chapter. Now, I could probably read this chapter a second time or a third time, and new ideas would rise to the top as cream rises to the top. So this is just the particular lens through which I read it right now. Now that's going to be a real challenge, I think, for some of us that want to talk a little bit more about science as a discipline, and that there are right answers and wrong answers. Well, the humanities person or the humanist, Fowler makes reference to humanist, those interested in literature and theology and philosophy and history and those kinds of disciplines, we're very comfortable with this place in the middle where figuring out what a text means is a matter of investigation over and over and over again. And that can sometimes be off-putting. In fact, it probably has been so far, because we've talked about a lot of different ways to look at these texts, and sometimes students just, they just want the right answer. Just what do you want, man? And there's so many different ways of looking at a text, and that's what gives it its mystery and its delight and its excitement to those of us that do what I do. And so I've been excited over the course of this term to welcome you into that conversation. So here's some things about Fowler that I think were about this chapter in Fowler that through that lens made an impact on me. Throughout the book, actually, not just in this chapter, though she's a little bit more explicit about it, I think, in this chapter than she is in other places. But throughout the book, Fowler has done a good job of modeling something for you. She's done a good job of modeling the way the humanist has this appreciation for and reliance on history. So if you notice, and her comments this time are a little bit more explicit. In fact, I would point you to page 115? Let me check my notes here. Oh, no, 116. In the middle, I have underlined, it's just under the block quote, the humanities use methods that are primarily critical, analytical, or speculative, and often include an historical element. Well, she has modeled that for you throughout this book. Well, what do you mean? Well, if you notice, one of the things that she does over and over again with each one of these provisions is that she'll trace the historical development of the provision. That's what historians do. That's what philosophers do. That's what theologians do. That's what literature profs do. We trace historical development, and thus we are attuned to history. And thus, and this comes in later in the chapter that I'll make some comments about, just because a text was published 500 years ago, biblical text, a long time ago, doesn't mean we don't use it. We still make use of those things. Now, in the sciences, right, emphasis is placed on the new, the cutting edge. That's not necessarily how historians go about their work, tracing development of ideas. Fowler has modeled that for you. And if you go back and look at the other chapters that have gone before and then, read through that lens going forward, you'll see this was the way the Code of Ethics was on this provision in 1965, and this is the way it was in 1978, and this is the way it was in 1985, and this is 2001, and now in 2015, this is where this provision stands. That is good historical method, and I think she's done a masterful job of presenting some of that to you. So you had that quote, on page 116. One other thing I want to draw your attention to is on page 115 at the top, the duty shifts considerably, and now the emphasis is on advancing the profession. Nursing knowledge development is in the background. And so here is another historical element that she's giving you as she's tracing this development. Pay attention to those things as you read Fowler.